Today we are in Norwich and we're going to tour the Millionaires Triangle. And we coined that term because there are a large number of mansions that were owned by the captains of industry who lived in Norwich, Connecticut in the 19th century, particularly in the latter half. And the campus behind me is Norwich Free Academy, which is the high school for Norwich and 7 surrounding towns. It's the designated high school, which means that it's a private school, but the towns pay the tuition. And it's significant to the tour because most of the people we'll be talking about today were involved in the founding of the academy in 1853. In the 1870s, during the Gilded Age, Norwich was one of the places to be. There was a significant number of people who were millionaires, both in today's money and also if you sort of extrapolated the value of what your net worth was in 1870 versus what it might be today. And at that time, even the aristocracy in Europe could live very well on $10,000 a year. In Norwich, there were something like 43 people that made more money than that, and that's income, not net worth, in a year. And they did not have to declare things like bank stocks and railroad stocks, so presumably their income was much greater. They pooled some of their money. The idea was to raise $75,000 to start the high school. And it was a place filled with prominent people. Their names would appear in the newspapers across the country. If Us Magazine or People or Entertainment Weekly had existed at that time, in all likelihood, they would have wanted to have somebody on site here most of the time because there seemed to be a great deal of interest in what was going on. And these people were well known across the country. In Norwich, living at that time, there was a United States Senator, the governor of the state of Connecticut, a congressman. There were a number of high-profile individuals. We'd have had the equivalent of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. We'd have had the president of Pfizer, the president of Amtrak, the president of Stop and Shop, directors of any number of national and regional, big regional firms, and a number transportation companies, Holland America, or some of the cruise lines, the railroads. They'd have been living here. So that's part of the reason why. And it was sort of a little Newport. It was a summer resort for people who came to New York City. So when you were walking around this area, you have to eliminate all of the modern buildings, forget the traffic, forget the automobiles, and just look at the big mansions. For the last few years, the Last Green Valley has sponsored tours, walking tours all up and down the area from the Massachusetts border as far south as the Thames River here in Norwich. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to participate in those. The Millionaires Triangle tour is based on the research I did for a book called Norwich and the Gilded Age, the Rose City's Millionaires Triangle. The Norwich Historical Society turned it into a brochure. So even though we're not doing the tours this year, you can follow the route using the brochures which are available from the Norwich Historical Society offices. So back to the scenario behind me. I mentioned that we had a United States Senator living here, and that would be Lafayette Foster. And his house was over to the left, and it later became the Norton Peck Library on the NFA campus. Today it is part of the Latham Science Center. And I might mention that there were donors 150 years ago who provided great amounts of money to the Academy, but also in more recent time, part of the library, the new library, was financed through Edwin Land. Edwin Land was a Norwich native and basically invented the Polaroid cameras, the instant photography. Also on campus, and we can't see it from here, is the Sidney Frank Center for the Performing Arts. And that was donated by NFA graduate Sidney Frank, who is the importer of Jägermeister and also Grey Goose vodka. So, and that's a relatively recent addition and a very nice addition to the campus. The first building on the campus was the Tyrrell Building, and it's also known as Main. And it's not the original building. It started with one building that was known as the Main Building. It housed the library, it housed some classrooms and some science labs, and it's grown from there. But the original incorporators donated the land. General William Williams, who lived in the Teal House, which is the big square white one, donated 7 acres of land. And we are standing currently on Chelsea Parade, but it was originally known as Williams Park for the general who during the War of 1812 used to drill his troops here. And he owned a fair amount of that property, and it was sold off piece by piece over the years. Williams and his wife were philanthropists of a major league, and interestingly enough, his wife, Harriet Peck Williams, had money in her own right, which was very unusual for the times. She had money, about as much money on the books as her husband did. And in some of the census records where they showed you were asked to declare how much property you owned, real and personal, she claimed $100,000 or more, which was about equal to her husband's, what he claimed. The general was active in education and was known to travel to the Mohegan Reservation, the Indian Reservation, where he taught Sunday school. His wife, after he died, donated the land for Park Church, and we'll talk about that later. And in her will, she was the last of her family. In her will, she left $1 million to found a girls' school in New London where one of her sons had been living, and it was established on the property where he and his family, before they died, had planned to build their home. That house later moved, or the school, I'm sorry, later moved to a property on what is now Route 32, and it's on the campus of Connecticut College. We know it today as the Williams School. One of the buildings on the campus is the Norton Gym, and that was donated by the family of Henry Norton. Henry Norton's house is on Washington Street. It's a Greek revival home. And it's said that when Henry Norton came to Norwich in the 1840s, he had $1 in his pocket. He managed with his 2 brothers to build a shipping and grocery empire during the late 1800s. He was a wholesale grocer. They had interests in shipping concerns. They had their own dock down at the harbor, so they could bring in raw materials and send out the things that they were exporting. This was a good time to be in the grocery business, and also if you were selling coal and or wood and materials to build with. The population of the city doubled about every 10 years from 1840 to about 1890. So there were a lot of new people coming in that needed a place to live, and they also needed to eat. Another name on the campus is Converse, as in the Converse Art Gallery. And after the turn of the century, around 1909, the Slater Museum had been established, and that is the high tower on the campus, and it's one of the few high schools in the country that actually has their own art museum associated with it. They wanted an art gallery, and William Slater, who was the donor of the museum in honor of his father, the industrialist John Slater, talked to his friend Charles Converse, who was a manufacturer of small arms, guns, and Converse was persuaded to donate the funding for what became the Converse Art Gallery. Charles Converse's house is just down Washington Street, and it's a Gothic-style house, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. And Converse was an interesting guy. He basically did a hostile takeover of the arms manufacturing company, the mill, which is a short distance down Sachem Street at the Falls. And then he made a great deal of money doing that. They introduced the Derringer, the Saturday night special of its day, and that became a very popular item in their inventory. But he was also very civic-minded. He served on the board of directors or trustees of the Otis Library, and also, as I said, was a supporter of NFA and also donated the art gallery. Park Congregational Church was built around 1880. It was designed by the architect Stephen Earle, who was from Worcester, Massachusetts, and somehow had been befriended by the Slaters, who had some connections there. He also was the designer of the Slater Memorial Museum and a house that was built for William Slater's mother, which is just down Broadway. Park Church also had a connection with a number. John Slater donated the funds for some of the stained glass windows, and Mrs. Williams donated the funding for the clock tower as well as a window. And a number of the other millionaires were very generous in contributing to the cost of construction for the church. This house was built for Mrs. John Slater somewhere in the early 1870s. It's not totally clear what happened to them. They had been married in 1844, 2 years after John Slater came to Norwich. John Slater and his brother inherited the family properties, mills in Rhode Island and in Connecticut. And the Connecticut properties went to John Slater, and they were largely located in Jewett City and Hopeville, Connecticut. But he chose to come to Norwich to live and started out in a mansion that still stands on Main Street at the corner of Park Street, what used to be known as the Elks Home in more recent years. They moved uptown on Broadway to an estate that's somewhere between 5 and 8 acres that's bordered by Broadway, Broad Street, Cedar Street, and Slater Avenue. But the mansion was torn down somewhere about 1909 or 10. But nevertheless, John Slater and his wife lived there from about 1860 until they separated in the early 1870s. John Slater stayed at the mansion. His son William apparently split his time between his father's house and his mother's. But by 1880, in the census, Mrs. Slater is recorded as living here with a coachman and a cook and several maids and a nephew that she identified in the census as an adopted son. William, by this time, was on the Grand Tour. They sent him to Europe for a couple of years after a couple of years of attendance at Norwich Free Academy. And then he went on to Harvard. Most of the boys from Norwich went to Yale, and most of them went to the scientific school, but he went to Harvard, and that became evident of his affinity to Massachusetts when his sister married a Boston lawyer, and there were other family connections with people in Boston, and then William and his wife had a place on the North Shore in later years. But prior to that time, it's not clear exactly what happened to the elder Slaters, but it would not surprise me to find out that Mrs. Slater was extremely depressed. They had 6 children. 4 of them died in infancy. The 2 remaining children were the eldest and the youngest, who was William. And the eldest was a daughter, and she died when she was in her late 20s after bearing 2 children. And apparently after the second child, she was ill and just didn't recover. When the Slaters were married, Mrs. Slater was Marianna Hubbard. Her father was at the time the wealthiest man in town. He was a manufacturer of paper and other products. Later they went into textile manufacturing. And she comes from a rather distinguished background. Not only was her father a manufacturer, her mother's family were the Landmans, who were very well known in the community, the state, and probably the nation. So when she married John Slater, she was marrying the boy next door because the Hubbard's house was on the site of what is now the post office on Main Street in Norwich, and that's right next to the house that Slater occupied. After William Slater graduated from Harvard, he came home and began working at the mill. His father died in 1883, a year after he established the John F. Slater Fund for the Education of Southern Freedmen, for which he put up $1 million. And back a ways, I said that the Slaters and other residents of Norwich were known throughout the country. Slater was able to get Rutherford B. Hayes, who had just finished his term as president, to be chairman of the trustees for this fund. Also was Supreme Court Chief Justice Morris Waite, who lived in Lyme, the Dodge of Phelps Dodge, and a number of other nationally known business and industrial leaders. Slater married a year after his father's death, and he married a young woman named Ellen Peck. Her mother was a member of the Young family, who originated in Killingly, and Ellen Young's brother John, and a classmate at Plainfield Academy, borrowed some money from the classmate's father, went to New York City, and opened a store. They did okay for the first couple of years, but it really started to take off in the third and fourth year, and eventually they moved uptown. John Young worked with them for about 20 years and then retired to Norwich. And at that time, when he retired, they changed the name of the firm, and it's what we know today as Tiffany and Company. So John Young was one of the co-founders of Tiffany's, and he had married a Norwich girl and retired to Norwich, where he became active in civic affairs. Now, another Young sibling married Charles Tiffany, and yet another Young sibling was Ellen Young, who married a man named Frederick Peck. Their daughter Ellen married William Slater. So when they were married, Slater became a member of the Tiffany family and seemed to really adopt that as his family after both of his parents died. He seemed to be very active in visiting with Ellen's sisters after they were married, and there were frequent articles in the newspapers about their visiting and weddings and that kind of thing. The most prominent figure in Norwich, statewide at least, was Governor William Alfred Buckingham. His house was down on Main Street, and even after many of his neighbors moved uptown, he remained there, even though it was right next to the railroad station, so there would have been a lot of activity. But nevertheless, he and his wife had 2 children. The young man died at an early age, leaving his daughter Eliza. She figures into the story because she married a man named William Aiken, who lives down on Washington Street. And William Aiken became a trusted advisor to the governor. He undertook a very hazardous mission to Washington to deliver dispatches to the governor's friend, Abraham Lincoln, who was isolated in the White House after the declaration of war at the start of the Civil War, and didn't know what was going on, whether any help was coming to Washington, because the Confederate soldiers had cut the telegraph lines and torn up the railroad tracks. So Washington, D.C. was isolated, even though it was the nation's capital. So William Aiken was dispatched to tell Lincoln that Buckingham was raising troops, and there were troops coming from others of the New England states and New York. He was able to successfully deliver that message after a number of hazards that he described in a report to the governor when he returned. 4 months later, he married the governor's daughter. 6 months later, he enlisted in the Navy, served a 90-day term of service as a paymaster, was present at the naval battle of Port Royal off the coast of South Carolina, which was the first naval engagement of the war, and then came home and was appointed Quartermaster General of the state of Connecticut, which meant he was responsible for procuring all the supplies and equipment that Connecticut's troops would need to fight the war. At that time, there was not really a very large federal army. It was more state militias that were called into action to do the fighting. Hence, we would get the 20th Maine, the 14th Wisconsin, that kind of thing, when they're describing the battles. Governor Buckingham was a very popular figure. At that time, the governors were elected yearly, and he was elected an unprecedented 7 times in a row. which is very, very unusual, and particularly during a war. He's one of the, I think there are only 4 nationwide governors who were elected all the way through the war. But he was very conscious of the need to support the troops and was known to go to a camp, and in one story he famously was talking to some of the Connecticut men, checking on their welfare, asking if they needed anything, and they said, well, it would be nice if we could see the paymaster because we haven't seen him in a while. And Buckingham found out how much was owed and wrote a personal check to cover those salaries. And that seemed to be how he operated. He was always very conscious of people in need and was a very kindly and very religious man. When he died in February of 1874, there were over 2,000 people standing in sub-freezing, really bitterly cold temperatures to see the funeral procession go by, and stood outside of the First Congregational Church near City Hall during the funeral services. Thanks for coming along on this brief tour of the Norwich Millionaires Triangle. I hope you're interested enough to want to know more. Brochures that will let you do a self-guided tour are available at the Norwich Historical Society's Visitor Center on the Norwich Town Green. In addition, if you want more information, as I said, the research has been based on the book that I wrote called Norwich in the Gilded Age, The Rose City's Millionaires Triangle. It's available on Amazon and also from the publisher, the History Press. And again, on behalf of the Last Green Valley, thank you for joining us.